Thank you all. What a great turnout. We've got a nice group here today. And I recognize so many people, but I would imagine we've got some new folks here too. Is anybody here for the first Zen Peacemaker event you've done? Ah, David, welcome. Good. And I can't see the hands that are cameras are off, but for David's information or anybody else, be sure to sign up for the newsletter. It's free. We send it once a week. We try not to bomb you with it, but it lets you know what we're doing. It lets you know of the events that are coming up. And I'm just going to plug a couple of them because the next, I don't know, the next 60 days or so are sort of a period of a lot of writers. Sean Tetsudo Sensei is a prolific writer and honored. And if you haven't read anything he's written, I highly recommend One Bird, One Stone. It's great. And that's part of what he'll be talking about today. But coming up in January, and I've had kind of a wish list, and I've gotten lucky lately. Coming up in January, the writer Pico Iyer will be our guest on the 21st, and his new book is out called A Flame, about silence and retreat. And then a week later, Red Pine, the translator Bill Porter, will be my guest, and I'm looking forward to that. And then in February, I've been chasing Peter Coyote around for 2 years and finally managed to connect. And Peter Coyote will be our guest in February. So, and he's got a book out just earlier this year, I think, on Zen practice. So you didn't come to listen to me, so I will say one last thing, and then I'll hand the mic to my friend Tetsudo. As you are able and as you are called, and if you find this worthwhile and helpful, please use the donate button. We can use all the support we can get. You know, we work on scheduling these events, you know, several months in advance. So there's a lot of staff time that goes into it. So whatever you can do to help will be most appreciated. Tetsudo is in the lineage of Maizumi Roshi of the Zen Center of Los Angeles, the White Plum Sangha, and lives, teaches, practices in Taos, New Mexico. So pretty much due south of me, right that way, about 5 hours, and up in the mountains. So if his power goes out, you'll know why. And if my power goes out, you'll know why. So anyway, enough of me. Tetsudo, thank you so much. And this is the third installment or this offering on this topic that Tetsudo, that Sean has done for us. And the first two have just been thoroughly enjoyable. Mad Ones, Wise Ones, and Rogues, Zen's American Ancestors. And I sincerely hope that Tetsudo will include himself.
Which one am I?
Check all the boxes. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks so much, Tetsudo.
Thank you, Sean. It's a pleasure to be here. Nice to see you all. I wonder, I can only see one screen of you at a time. There's many of you. How many of you were here for one of my earlier talks on the subject? Just helps me know where to start. Okay. All right. Okay, a few of you, but yeah, so I'll just give a little bit of background. My transmission teacher is Jerry Shishin Wick, who I'm sure many of you know. And before that, I studied with John Daido Luri for many years. And I was also his student assistant when I was at Naropa Institute, John Daido Luri's assistant, a crazy number of years ago now, 30 years or something like that, when I was getting my master's in writing at Naropa Institute. And as Daido's TA, I teaching assistant, he became a mentor and an elder friend as well as my teacher because we spent so much time together. And he started telling me stories about his practice and other people's practice. And I started to think, somebody should should make a collection of Western Zen stories, because I know we've all seen the collections of Eastern Zen stories. And so I started talking to him about it. And anyway, I realized somebody should do it. That somebody ended up being me. So that resulted in this book, One Bird, One Stone. And it's a collection of Western Zen stories. They're not intended to be koans. There's a few in there that could perhaps be used that way, but in general, it's more like, probably many of you are familiar with the Paul Reps Nyogen Senzaki book. Back in the day, it was one of the few Zen books in the 60s and 70s that we could find, Zen Flesh, Zen Bones. So that's a collection of Zen stories that are not intended to be quite as daunting and obscure as koans can be, but more easily graspable. So this is what I've been drawing on. I ended up traveling all over the country, talking to something like 100 different Zen teachers and collecting practice, Zen teachers and senior students, and collecting their practice stories. And so that's what I've been sharing. And today I want to go into some stories about, well, first, some of the people around Suzuki Roshi, Katagiri Roshi, and Kobun Chino Roshi, and then move on to some more contemporaries like Bernie Glassman, who of course founded this organization. And one of my favorite encounters was with Walter Nowak, who was a lesser known figure, rather eccentric, who went to Japan right after the war, and had trouble actually getting a visa to go to Japan to study with Japanese Zen teachers, and came back and started a center in Maine. And I knew one of his students from Zen Mountain Monastery, where I practiced with Daido Roshi. And he managed to get me a meeting with Walter, which was not an easy thing to do, because the surviving teachers who I spoke to, when the first edition of the book came out, it's going on 20 years ago. We have a more recent second edition, came out about 10 years ago. But the teachers who were still alive and who I spoke to, there was still this kind of lingering suspicion, I think, maybe from the 70s, 80s, 90s, that writers and journalists were interested in Zen practice, but in a superficial level. And so there was kind of some suspicion with some of the teachers and some of the students of what was I up to, and was I a serious Zen student myself? And so I kind of got a lot of testing behavior, and sometimes, well, why don't I dive in? One of my favorite stories was a refusal from Kobun Chino Roshi to talk to me, but his refusal to talk to me came after a very long encounter that made a great story anyways, as sometimes these things turned out. But first, I just want to give a little bit of context. Many of you may know this, but if you know anything about Suzuki Roshi San Francisco Zen Center, I'm sure some of you have practiced there, and I'm quite familiar with it. But he had Katagiri Roshi and Kobun Chino Roshi came over to assist him at different times, and then they went on to form their own centers. And so I want to talk about that group of teachers a little bit first. Let's see. I think I'll just dive into this story about an encounter I had with Kobun Chino, because it's fun. But just first, a quote from Katagiri Roshi, who started Zen Center in Minnesota, of all places, up in the cold, cold north. And Natalie Goldberg, who was a student of Katagiri Roshi. A lot of you know Natalie. She's a friend, and as part of the book, I went up to Minnesota, and she was living up there at the time, training with one of Katagiri's successors, and so I spoke to a lot of Katagiri successors. Of course, he was gone, but so some of this material comes from Natalie and some of the other people who practiced with him in the old days. So this was a quote from Natalie about Katagiri. He said, "I've been reading your Descartes. Very interesting. I think, therefore I am. I think he forgot to mention the other part. I'm sure he knew. He must have just forgot to mention it. I don't think, therefore I'm not." And I've often thought that over, that this is our practice, right? We let go of thought and return to direct experience. And this is how we find out the true nature of the self. So, as I think about it, Descartes he definitely grasped part one, which I think, and thereby create myself, right? And bring myself into being as a conventional self. Anyway, Kobun, as he liked people to call him, and I eventually got to know him fairly well before he died. I think, well, it must be 20 years ago or a little bit more now. But he had a center here in New Mexico, in Taos County, just up in the mountains outside the town. And I practiced there a good amount. A lot of times Kobun wasn't there because Kobun was famous for being a reluctant Roshi. There's stories about students coming to see him in his house up on El Salto Mountain here in New Mexico, wanting to talk about Zen. And in one case, he actually excused himself to go to the bathroom, climbed out the window, and disappeared, and rather than talk to the student about Zen. So I did a number of sessions, Zen retreats up at his center, and sometimes he'd show up and sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes when he didn't show up, his students would say, well, he's doing his absent teaching, which I thought was a little bit of a rationalization, honestly. I think, Kobun was eccentric, and he, from what I understand from some of his students who are friends that I've talked to, apparently when he was a young monk going into a Heiji at age 19, all the lights went on and he basically had a big opening experience. And ever after, one of the first times I saw Kobun in his kind of public persona was when I was at Naropa Institute, and there was some sort of event where there was a bunch of dignitaries, and they were all sitting in the front row. I don't remember what it was, but there was a whole line of very dour-looking Rinpoches, and in the middle of them is Kobun, who always looked like he had a kind of a light bulb in his head. He had this certain glow, but I think he was one of those cases where he had that big opening when he was very young and he didn't know how it happened, and he kind of always thought that if everybody else just practiced, it would happen to them too. And when that turned out to not be the case, he didn't always know what to do. So I actually think the founder of Zen Peacemakers, Bernie Glassman, in some ways had similar experience with students. He had a big opening in his practice at a certain point, and he thought everyone does Zazen and it'll happen to them too. And it just doesn't seem to work that way, does it? Sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't. It's by grace, and you never know where the grace will strike, right? So, all right. So this is an encounter with Kobun during a retreat I took. Kobun is here, the reluctant Roshi, at the tiny temple of Hokoji, a bit of old Japan perched on the flanks of El Salto Mountain in northern New Mexico. It's packed to the gills for the first time, in years, because it was known that he was actually going to be there for the session this time. So a lot of people showed up. On the high seat at the center of the zendo, he sits, a study in gray in his gray outer robe, gray with his close cropped hair, gray faced in the dim zendo light. The blue muffler wrapped around his neck against the Rocky Mountain chill, the unshaven scalp, and the fact that his students all simply call him Kobun are all marks of his unconventionality. He speaks quietly, wanderingly, like a bird flitting from one branch to the next, and it's only after the movement is complete that it becomes apparent there is any pattern to it. I feel very blessed to have all of you here today for this founder's ceremony. You might say, actually, that I am blessed out. Hello, Barbara. How are you? How is Paul? He must be 14 by now. Ah, yes. Actually, this entire mountain is a temple, but this place, indicating the zendo, this place is a factory of Buddhas. And that's what Kobun's talks were like. He'd break out of them to address somebody and go into something about Dogen and go into just very idiosyncratic. So for the first time in 4 years for this Rohatsu retreat, he has returned to Hokoji, the temple he founded in New Mexico. This would have been in the 90s, I think. I've been able to attend only the last couple days of Rohatsu. I did, however, stop earlier in the week to hear one of his talks, as did a number of other visitors, several of whom, between Kobun's poetic, wandering manner, his Japanese accent, and his soft-spoken delivery, appeared more than a bit baffled by the experience. I very much like your Roshi, remarked a visiting monk, but I can't understand a word he says. Still, there is much that is charming and illuminating about Kobun's verbal meanderings, and every so often, if you're patient enough to sit through long stretches of puzzlement, there emerge small jewels of great idiosyncratic beauty. Here's some quotes. Inside your skin and the skin of a dog, it is exactly the same. Past and future do not exist without you. Everything you need for your life and your practice are directly in front of you in the present moment. Those who die wrapped in Buddha's great cloak die a beautiful death. Kobun, who spent many years in the San Francisco Bay Area, delights in referring to the long, narrow meditation hall converted from a carport as his cable car zendo, and he goes off on long riffs about where it might be headed and when it might stop. This never ceases to amuse him, so his talks are peppered with laughter. Diane, the center's caretaker, calls him our poet Zen master. On the last morning of the retreat, in the middle of one of the final sitting periods, I'm settled deeply into my zazen when Kobun's voice emerges abruptly from his seat in the zendo, breaking the deep, dark silence that has grown there. The moon is high, Kobun begins, apropos of what I can't imagine since it's currently 11 o'clock in the morning. The moon is high and it gleams upon the roof of the temple and in the depths of the temple pond with its many swimming koi. Amid the communal aching of backs and legs, I can feel minds beginning to shift. Minds that have been sitting in silence for 6 days, struggling with pain in the knees and back that comes from extended sitting. Minds emerging from silence to wonder, where on earth could he be going with this? Beside the pond, continues the Roshi's soft voice, stand 2 figures, one tall and one short. The tall one is the temple priest, who is my father. The short one is a burglar. The priest is just surprised in the act of robbing the temple. I will gladly bring you all the temple riches, says my father, the priest, while the robber holds him at knife point. But if you are such a master thief, perhaps you can first solve for me one question. Can you catch one of the koi in the pond without getting your hands wet? To make Kobun's long story short, the robber is unable to respond and he leaves without taking anything. I don't know if this was a real story or not. The priest was supposedly his father. As one might expect, 3 months later, the robber returns and presents the priest with an answer. Kobun's father takes the burglar as his disciple and sets him up in the village with an honest business, a shoe shop of all things. The story, which is delivered in a far less linear version than that I present here, is interspersed with long pauses and is spoken in such a low voice that those at the far end of the zendo are surely unable to hear it all. It's offered with no explanation, and when it's finished, Kobun ends as suddenly as he began, leaving the zendo again ringing with silence. So in the break between the end of the retreat and the ceremony, founder's ceremony that was happening that afternoon, I interviewed one of his students, Bob Kruger, a longtime student of Katagiri's and later Kobun's. There's a tradition in Zen, Bob says, that your first teacher is a supportive fatherly figure, but your second teacher is supposed to be more challenging. That's certainly the way it's been with me. A friend once said that Katagiri Roshi was hard on the outside but soft on the inside, while Kobun was soft on the outside and hard on the inside. That's been my experience. Katagiri always supported and encouraged me. But as for Kobun, well, I never know what he's going to do. I sometimes get nervous being around him, especially after a retreat, because I never know what he's going to come up with. Truer words were never spoken. No sooner do we step back into the caretaker's house to prepare for the ceremony than we're greeted by an exuberant Kobun, his eyes flashing like a child's, who immediately turns all the planned activities upside down. All right, he announces, it's time for Koan theater. You, he points to me, you be the tall one, the priest, my father. And you, he singles out Bob, who's been doing his best to recede chameleon-like into the background. You're the short one, the robber. You'll need a hat. At this point, everyone points to a sort of black, odd fedora on the head of one of the participants. And you'll need a dagger. Someone grabs a huge knife from the kitchen and hands it to Bob, and someone else plops the hat on his head. There, shouts another participant, tossing some crumpled up papers into the center of the room. That's the ransacked temple. All right, nods Kobun, grinning. Go ahead. Go ahead with what, we ask. The koan, you know, the moon shines from on high into the depths of the pond. Beside it stand two figures, one tall and one short. I can't pretend to remember all the details of his talk that morning, but there's nothing to do but dive in. All right, I accost Bob, who points his kitchen knife menacingly at me. I'll gladly bring you the temple treasures, but first, if you're such a master thief, show me how to catch one of the koi in this pond without getting your hands wet. I can't do that, says Bob sensibly. For a moment, we're at a standstill. How about doing the earlier part of the story, someone suggests, when you're in the temple and he first discovers the thief? Okay, we agree. People strew more wreckage around the living room to make the ransacked temple more believable. You have to understand, nobody's preparing for the ceremony at this point, which there's dignitaries coming from out of town and all sorts. All completely diverted. I step into the wrecked temple space and all at once Bob lunges out at me. Bring me the temple treasures, he demands, brandishing the kitchen knife. Everyone's laughing, blowing off steam from the session. Wait a minute, I turn to Kobun. The priest is your father, right? I'd never gotten clear whether this was supposed to be an old Zen story, into which he added his father, who had been a temple priest, or whether it actually happened that way. Yes, agrees Kobun, you are my father. I turn back to Bob. Be gone, thief, I cry, or I'll call my son Kobun to give you a good thrashing. At this, the room breaks up. Kobun is slapping his hands against his knees in glee at the spectacle he's created. Meanwhile, Bob's really settled into his role, or the twist I've thrown him arouses genuine fear, for his eyes grow wide and he steps back a pace. Now we're both at a loss. Okay, coaches Kobun. It's 3 months later. You're sitting beside the pond when the thief returns with his answer. I'm waiting there in the living room moonlight, standing beside the coffee table koi pond, when Bob sidles up again out of the darkness and plunks himself down beside me. Well, thief, I greet him. You've returned. Did you bring me an answer? At that moment, as though on cue, Diane's little white terrier comes running up. By this time, we're both seated on the floor, and Bob reaches out automatically to pet it. I stare at the dog, who actually is about the size of one of those huge temple goldfish, the koi, with a long moment of amazement. "You've done it," I cry. "Here is the koi. You've caught it without getting your hands wet." The room dissolves. Kobun on the couch is rocking back and forth, slapping his hands against his knees, while the dog prances about, delighted to be the center of so much attention. After it all settles down a bit, Bob asks, "So what next? This is where I become a shoe salesman, right?" "Oh yeah," I plop my bare foot into his lap, feeling loose with the crazy energy that sometimes comes after sesshin. "I'll set you up in an honest business, thief, if you can measure this foot, which fills the entire universe." So later, we start preparing for the ceremony, chopping wood because the place is heated with wood. And then the event itself, attended by various spouses, children, and members of the community. And at last, as dusk falls over El Salto Mountain with its great walls of granite, comes the celebratory potluck. At some point during the proceedings, Kobun explains to a group of us that the reason he'd brought up the story of the thief that morning was in response to the prevailing Western attitude that one's supposed to get something from the practice of Zen. What we thieves end up getting, Kobun explains, is only what we had all along. Through it all, I've been watching for the right moment to ask Kobun whether he might have time while he's in town to do an interview. Finally, after the crowd has dwindled, I find him sitting alone on the couch, looking surprisingly small, even a bit frail in his gray robes. "Excuse me, Kobun," I say. "I know you're very busy, but I'm working on a book on Zen in America, and I've been wondering if you might have the chance in the next few days to do a brief interview." The answer I receive is pure Kobun, for he grins broadly, nodding his head in apparent assent while clearly enunciating no. The two responses are so conflicting that for a moment I'm unable to process the information. "Excuse me," I say. "No," repeats Kobun, still nodding. "I have no time. But tell them," he pauses for a moment to consider, "tell them all that we know nothing of Zen." He smiles once more. "Tell them we only know just sitting." With that, he folds his hands in his gray-robed lap and looks at me. "Tell them that." He nods again. "It was very nice to practice with you." You gotta love of course, the eccentrics always make the best stories, right? I wonder, I can only see one page of you at a time, but I wonder how many of you knew Kobun or studied with him. I bet a number of you did. A few of you, yeah. Let's see, trying to go to the other page. Anyone on page 2 practice with Kobun? Okay, yeah, some of you did. So I want to say a little bit about Katagiri also. So in writing down the bones, Natalie Goldberg describes how Dining Katagiri, her teacher at the Minnesota Zen Center, used to say, "Have kind consideration for all sentient beings." Once she asked him, "What are sentient beings anyway? Are they only things that feel?" Katagiri told her, "We have to be kind even to the chair, the air, the paper, the street. That's how big and accepting our minds have to become." I bet a number of you know Wendy Johnson. She told me a little story about practicing with Katagiri. Wendy Johnson she lives near Green Gulch, and she's a Zen teacher as well, practiced way back at Zen Center of San Francisco Zen Center in Tassajara. So she told me this story. During a retreat at Katagiri's Country Center in southern Minnesota, which they use for only several months each summer. She says, "The night before I'd been in the Zendo by myself. It was sesshin, retreat, and I had this experience where I imagined all of the Zafus I'm sure 90% of us know the zafus are the sitting cushions. 90% of the zafus, 90% of you know the zafus. I mean, I had this experience where I imagined all the zafus being there all through the seasons without us sitting on them. There was a kind of continuity. It was a very vivid experience. The next day during a talk, Katagiri said, if you can't break the frame around your life, maybe you should not pretend and keep going on in this lineage as though you're doing that, because everything depends on breaking the frame. I love that. I've never heard that from anyone else, breaking the frame around your life. It's very evocative, isn't it? Wendy goes on to say, somebody had asked the head student a couple of weeks before what real effort meant, and she hadn't been able to answer. On this day, Katagiri said, effort, effort. You always think about effort in terms of human effort. But what about the effort of a zafu practicing night after night? They keep going every season, and there's no comment about their effort, the effort it takes them to hold you up. Or how about the effort that an animal makes when it's hungry, the effort of a deer? Wendy says he went on and on and on like that, and she remembers beginning to weep. He'd brought it up, that same experience she'd had the night before. Oftentimes Zen students will say it seems like the teacher was entering their mind, reading their mind. Wendy says it was very powerful. I had a visceral experience of the frame around my life, dissolving and cracking open. I'm very grateful to Katagiri Roshi. Katagiri's stories abound, illustrating the broad and lasting influence he and his Dharma heirs have exerted on Zen in America. Some of these stories, as with many of the first Asian teachers, involve cases of cultural or linguistic misunderstanding. There's one story that appears in Natalie Goldberg's really wonderful memoir of training with Katagiri. It's called Long Quiet Highway. If you haven't read it, it's a wonderful book about training with Katagiri Roshi. One of Katagiri's former students, Yvonne Rand, who I interviewed, tells this story. Some of the leaders of our community of practitioners wanted to do fundraising, and they decided to have an afternoon tea party. They got all their grandmother's linen tablecloths and silver and teacups and made sandwiches with the crust cut off. They invited what we used to describe as the Minneapolis St. Paul swells, all the people of wealth and prestige, none of whom ever visited the Zen Center or were ever likely to. At a certain point after the guests had arrived, Katagiri Roshi came down the stairs looking radiant as he could in his robes. He looked at everyone, welcomed them, and began, you know, of course, we all will die. The guests, it's reported, all left early and the center netted scarcely a penny. I want to pick a couple of other stories about Katagiri out of here. Here's some quotes from Katagiri. In Zen, you let your frontal lobe rest. Whatever you think is delusion. The moment between before and after we call truth. Anyway, do Zazen. So there's a story or two I'd like to share here about him. So Katagiri Roshi was invited to give a seminar at a yoga conference in Chicago in order to counter the typical American concern regarding what one was going to get from doing Zazen, an attitude he imagined might be prevalent at the conference. Katagiri titled his topic, Zazen is useless. He was surprised when no one showed up for his talk. And there were three kind of famous slogans that Katagiri used all the time. Continue under all circumstances. Make positive effort for the good. Don't be tossed away. I've thought of those so many times in my own practice. Sometimes people are a little confused by don't be tossed away, but I think what he meant is don't be thrown off track, you know? But if you have to continue under all circumstances, then I guess even when you're thrown off track, you do that, right? You continue. Since we've been talking about Kobun and Katagiri, I want to share a couple of anecdotes about Suzuki Roshi, who, well, if I'm sure most of you know something about Suzuki Roshi, who founded the San Francisco Zen Center in the 1950s. He actually came over to be the resident priest to a temple that catered to Japanese immigrants in the Bay Area. And same thing with Maizumi Roshi. He came over to be the resident priest for a similar temple in Los Angeles. I think neither of them had any idea what to do when a bunch of beatniks started showing up, wanting to learn about Zen and practice with them. But eventually, in both cases, they ended up creating a practice center, and rather than a temple for Japanese immigrants. So, but Suzuki Roshi, I just should mention his book Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. I'm sure most of you know it, but if you don't know it or haven't read it, it's kind of the Bible of Zen. If there's one single book on Zen to recommend to anyone, it would be that one. But he passed away in 1971, and quite early, too early, just like Katagiri did. They both died from cancer. I think they were in their 50s, both of them. I think just quite a big strain carrying Zen to America. Can you imagine? It's very strange that it happened at all, really. If you think about it, it took the Beats and the hippies to open the door to something that would have seemed so culturally strange. But just a couple stories about Suzuki Roshi here. These are about the end of his life. In 1971, Suzuki Roshi fell ill, and he became jaundiced. For a long time, all the tests were inconclusive. Fearing hepatitis, the doctors insisted on a strict quarantine of all his food and eating utensils as a precaution against spreading an infection. Finally, Suzuki checked into the hospital for more extensive testing. This also came from Yvonne Rand, who shared one of the prior stories about Katagiri. Zen Center Secretary Yvonne Rand remembers visiting his hospital room on the day his results came through. She found him sitting on the edge of the bed, legs dangling in front of a tray filled with food. Roshi, she said, "What was the result? What did they tell you?" Suzuki smiled broadly and mouthed the words, "I have cancer." "Cancer," repeated Yvonne, slowly sitting down beside him. "But Roshi, then why are you smiling?" "Because now we can eat together," said Suzuki Roshi. With that, he picked up a fork full of food and put it in her mouth. And this is also Yvonne talking about his very last days, or his very last months and days. She says, "During the months before Suzuki Roshi died, his wife and I alternated taking care of him. At the time, each day seemed like an ordinary day. Taking care of him was very straightforward and simple. There was a kind of presence and thoroughness in the way he was when he was dying, an extraordinary teaching of the inseparability of how one lives and how one dies. It was only afterwards, when I looked back upon these months, that I realized that this was really extraordinary, but it was extraordinary ordinariness." His doctor kept worrying about how much pain Suzuki Roshi must be in, as he had metastasized gallbladder cancer, which is supposed to be very painful. Roshi always said, "I'm fine." He did finally take some pain medication one day so his doctor would feel better, but he didn't like the way it affected his mind. Early on the morning of his final day, around 3 a.m., he told his wife he wanted to take a bath. After the bath, he got back into bed and told his wife he wanted to see Richard Baker, who became, many of you will know, Richard Baker became his Dharma heir and took over San Francisco Zen Center. And there's a whole story after that, which I won't go into. But anyway, according to Richard Baker's own account, upon his arrival, he greeted his dying teacher by asking Suzuki Roshi, "Where shall we meet again?" Suzuki Roshi responded by drawing a big sumie circle, the Enso or Zen circle, symbolizing wholeness or completeness, in the air with his finger. A 7-day retreat was scheduled to begin that morning, and Suzuki Roshi died just as the bell to open the retreat was sounding. Everyone came one by one through that first morning of sesshin to do their last dokusan with him. Dokusan's the private meeting with the teacher. Again, probably 90% of you or 100% of you know that. So they actually stepped in to do dokusan with him, although he was gone. Well, his body had died, which must have been a rather extraordinary way to begin a retreat. Yvonne says, later I went with Richard Baker and Roshi's son to the mortuary. The mortuary people let us prepare his body and put him in his robes and put his body in the coffin. Remember, this is 1971 and all this is very new and strange to anyone outside the Zen world. They gave us a chapel room where someone could sit in meditation with him every day for a week. There was a sort of stage with sliding stained glass windows behind it. At the end of the week, when the time came to cremate the body, no one would leave. We just kept staying. Finally, the mortuary people, realizing no one was going anywhere, slid open the stained glass doors. The group stepped back and lifted his coffin into the crematorium oven. Mrs. Suzuki pushed the button and started the fire. Then we all went and sat down until the cremation was over. The mortuary people didn't know what to make of it. I think for those of us who were taking care of him, there wasn't this kind of sudden, sharp, he's gone. What I'd learned from being in that situation was that there's really a continuum of dying. Death, sitting with the body, watching it change, and then cremation, and then taking care of the ashes. So there was this very expanded process called dying. And Suzuki Roshi really opened that experience, so I saw what was possible. His passing was just a continuation of his life. Toward the end, he'd been so hardly there. He was like a wisp, and in the end, there was only breath, breathing. Katagiri Roshi visited Suzuki Roshi just before he died. As Katagiri stood by the bedside, Roshi looked up and said to him, "I don't want to die." Katagiri bowed and said, "Thank you for your great effort." Shortly before his death, Suzuki Roshi told Stan White, "Don't grieve for me. I know who I am. I know where I'm going. Don't you worry about a thing." So, I think we can move on at this point to Walter Nowak, who is one of my favorite eccentrics in the Zen world.
Tetsudo, if you'd like, I don't know if we want to interrupt you, but Didi has her hand up. It looks like.
Oh, sure. Let's.
A comment or a question?
Yeah, please. You're muted though. I will leave some time also.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay. Oh, I'm part of a study group that is studying Suzuki Roshi's Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind.
Oh, great.
And a part that we just read actually on Tuesday was that he was very very impressed by a waterfall he saw. It was over 1,000 feet. And the way he talked about that, of course there was a great amount of water coming to the edge and then going over the edge, and that he sort of it was as if he in a way anthropomorphized. He said that, imagine the drops, the very singular drops that are going down, how they might feel, kind of discombobulated, kind of separate from, and that would allow them to feel this kind of disconnected and not quite right, maybe.
Individual, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Individual, and that in a way that's life, that's us. Unless, little mind joins with big mind, but there's still that falling, there's still that experience of being separate. But all of this, of course, is as natural could be, as can be. And I thought that was very beautiful, very beautiful.
Yeah, and then of course all the water joins at the bottom again.
Right. So that's kind of like
I
life
remember
and
that
death.
section. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Yeah.
Kind of like life and death right there.
Yeah. Right. Thank you. Yeah, I will leave some time at the end for us to do questions and comments as well. But thank you, Dee. You've reminded me, I'll tell a lighter story about Suzuki Roshi before we move on. I don't have this marked, so I'll just have to tell it from memory. Somebody from a newspaper, I think it was San Francisco Chronicle, came and interviewed Suzuki Roshi at the time when the Zen Center was really growing and very vital, and it's kind of a big, was newsworthy, let's put it that way. And at the end of the interview, the reporter, Suzuki Roshi had a canary, I think, in a cage. And at the end of the interview, the reporter asked Suzuki Roshi, if you're so interested in freedom and you're training people in finding freedom, how can you keep a bird in a cage? And Suzuki Roshi said, you know what, you're right. And he opened the cage and he let the bird fly out. And but there's a second part to the story, which is, I think the reporter, I might have this a little bit wrong, I'm doing it from memory, but the reporter came back sometime later and to touch up the article and get a few more words from Suzuki Roshi, and noticed that the cage was still open, and asked, well, what happened to the bird? And one of Suzuki Roshi's students was there, and the student said, kind of meekly and sadly, I'm afraid the cat ate the bird. Suzuki Roshi felt very bad about it.
Oh.
There's some sort of symbolism in there about freedom and the dangers thereof, right?
Yeah.
All right, I'll move on to, there's a couple of things in the chat. Oh, I'm not able to see them for some reason. Okay, I'll move on to this meeting with Walter Nowak. And I want to share a little bit about my meeting with Bernie Glassman, who founded this group. Of course, many of you know a lot about him, but Susan's got her hand raised. Did you want to say something or ask something? No? I see a yellow hand in the air. What is the sound of one electronic hand clapping? All right. So Walter Nowak used to tell his students, Lao Tzu once said that every man is a good man. However, he would add, that's not the part that concerns us. So a friend of mine, Stephen from Zen Center from Zen Mountain Monastery, ended up arranging this meeting with Walter. Stephen and I mount the hill to where Walter Nowak, with that peculiarly vigorous walk certain old men possess, is shuttling purposefully between a wheelbarrow and an arrangement of large stone blocks. I thought when Stephen pointed the place out from the road yesterday that the blocks were simply building materials, left over from the fire that consumed Walter's house some 10 years ago. And that is what they are. But as we crest the hill, it becomes apparent that the stones are not just lying where they fell, but they've been arranged into a sort of mandala, with 5 enormous stone lintels propped on supporting blocks, pointing out like fingers over the valley below. This is in Maine, we're visiting him. Walter, wearing a white baseball cap and the kind of wraparound sunglasses one expects to see on a brightly clad cyclist, is now kneeling, spading moss from the wheelbarrow into position around the stones. He rises to meet us. "Do you like my Stonehenge?" he asks, with a broad gesture toward the arrangement. His smile is brilliant, and his greeting reminds me eerily of a scene from my own novel, The Hope Valley Hubcap King, in which the hero finally meets the eccentric sage he spent the whole book seeking, and he finds the old fellow arranging a sculpture upon the ground. "Walter," says Stephen as he embraces his old teacher, "did you move these stones yourself? Weren't they all stacked up behind the barn the last time I was here?" Walter shrugs. "I just tipped them into the wheelbarrow, and from there on it was easy. I had Alan help me with the long ones, but the rest I did myself." We look appreciatively at the arrangement. The blocks must weigh 150 pounds each. "Walter, this is Sean," says Stephen. Walter shakes my hand, then gestures to a tree stump and sits himself on another stump across from me. "Have a seat. Now what's all this book business you want to talk to me about?" He peers at me from behind his sunglasses. "As you may have heard, I'm not very big on books. Some of you may know a couple books written by an author, John Willem van de Wettering. I'm probably butchering the Dutch name. Van de Wettering wrote several books about Zen practice, one in Japan and one back in America. And the one in America, had to do with training with Walter at his place in Maine. And the one in Japan, he also was where Walter was training there, so he knew Walter there too. So Walter figures prominently in both of them, but the books brought a lot of people showing up to a lot of curiosity seekers showing up at Walter's place, which he didn't appreciate very much. So thus he's not very big on books, and Stephen had to kind of talk him into meeting me. So we're off and running. Stephen had warned me that Walter was likely to be squirrely. His aversion to curiosity seekers, the press, and the like is legendary. Although he's a world-class pianist, he's refused to record, tour, or perform in anything resembling the conventional manner. It's entirely possible, despite the fact that Stephen was a close student of his, that he may refuse to speak to me at all. As rumor has it, he once turned away Alan Watts when Watts came to see him. Besides, as far as Zen goes, Walter at this point is officially retired. Walter smiles again widely, and I see his teeth, small stone-like rectangles. "Well," I begin, "I'm compiling a collection of contemporary American Zen stories, and since I know you were one of the first Westerners to formally study Zen—" "Ah, the first, the second, the 1/2, what does that matter? But here, the sun's in your eyes. Let's switch seats." With that, he rises to his feet. This combination of evasiveness and concern confuses me. "But Walter, then the sun will be in your eyes." "That's why I've got these." Walter taps his wraparound shades as he herds me over to the opposite stump, and we both sit down again. "So tell me," he continues, not missing a beat, "this is your book, isn't it? What does that have to do with me? How can I help with your book?" "Well," I say, "Stephen and I practiced together at Zen Mountain Monastery, and he's been telling me about his years of training with you." At this point, a car pulls into the driveway, and Walter springs to his feet to investigate. He's no more than halfway there, however, when the car backs up and drives off again. Walter takes a turnabout too, and now he's back to dance the dance with me again. "So what I'd like," I start over, "is to maybe hear about your early experiences." By this time, Walter's wearing a permanent half smile as he jousts and banters at me from behind his shades. "I'm busy," he says. "I've got projects, practicing, and what good is reading about Zen anyway?" But what if a book can lead people to practice, I say. At this point, a propane truck pulls up and Walter's off once more. Stephen shakes his head and smiles at me. You've got a tiger by the tail. He could go on for hours like this, or decide to give in and talk, or just cut the whole thing off. He shrugs his shoulders. I shrug back. I'm feeling strangely relaxed. Through some internal process I don't entirely understand, I've come to the conclusion I might as well enjoy the experience, whatever happens. Even a refusal from Walter would be colorful. I'd already kind of have half the story by then, right? Even if he said he didn't want to talk to me. But the interaction with the propane man must have brought Walter to some decision, because this time he just walks up and says, well, as long as you're here, maybe you'd like to see my Buddha hall. Next thing I know, we're trooping down the slope. Walter between us in the direction of a small wooden building. All at once, Walter turns and takes me by the elbow, practically lifting me into the air with the vigor of his action. He looks straight into my eyes. He's got his glasses lifted now, and he's got the palest, clearest blue eyes I think I've ever seen, like there's nothing in them but sky. And he says something like, well, so what do you think about all this then, Sean, huh? And again, I see those small, perfect teeth in that broader-than-life smile. With his white hair spilling from beneath his baseball cap, he might have been a tow-headed 10-year-old hurrying me along to the clubhouse to show me his baseball cards. Then we're inside. Watch your head, he says as I step through the low door, and watch your feet, he says as Stephen steps through. Well, announces Walter, this is it, the Buddha Hall. Built like his Stonehenge of salvaged remnants of his house. The roof is made of smoke-stained boards shading darkly to charcoal at the edges. The far side of the building is unfinished, a blend of glass and plexiglass panels with blue plastic tarp tied across the gable. The walls are lined with ancient-looking Chinese and Japanese texts. Boy, Walter, I said, for someone who doesn't like books, you've sure got a lot of them here. Walter just smiles. I'm beginning to realize he's a bit hard of hearing from all those years spent operating the sawmill he and his Zen students started at the farm. Having invited us to sit on cushions on the tatami matting, Walter steps to the altar where he assembles a small shrine, placing who? It's a figure, perhaps it's Canon, Bodhisattva of compassion, back upon her lotus seat. This is original 13th century, given to me by my teacher before I left Japan, explains Walter. I don't like to leave it up when there's no one here. I'm afraid it'll fall over. Don't know what I'll do with it one of these days. I'll have to send it back, I suppose, since there's no one I want to leave it to. It wouldn't seem right for it to just end up in a museum. His words seem more than a bit poignant, given the fact that he's finished his life as a Zen teacher without leaving behind a Dharma heir. But now Walter's pulling down texts from the shelves, and he's rapidly building up a head of steam. He's explaining the difference between ancient Chinese and Japanese transliteration systems, pointing out ideograms and telling us how he had to learn both in order to study the classic Koan collections, which, when he was in Japan, were not yet available in English. Before I know it, he's moved on to the Sanskrit roots of Indo-European languages, pausing every once in a while to say with a sly smile, but I don't suppose any of this is used to your book, is it? Before plunging back in. I don't care about usefulness at this point. I'm simply consumed by the spectacle of a man. I remember reading somewhere an observation that psychoanalyst Erich Fromm made about D.T. Suzuki. Some people, said Fromm, manage to retain a childlike sense of life's wonder, but only at the expense of cutting off awareness of suffering and thereby living in a world of illusion. There are some few, however, who manage to retain their sense of joy and openness without closing themselves off from life's harsh realities. D.T. Suzuki, according to Fromm, was of this type, and Walter strikes me this way as well. Both eyes wide open, one seeing the light and the other looking into the darkness. yet somehow sustaining an unceasing enthusiasm for the wondrous absurdity of it all. But Walter is on a roll, and the conversation is going by so fast, I'll never be able to remember a fraction of it. So now that our rapport seems well established, I venture, "Excuse me, Walter, but I wonder if you'd mind if I use my tape recorder. It's only a small one, very unobtrusive." There's a moment of silence during which he examines me curiously. Then it's, "Nah, what would you want to do that for?" "Well," I begin, "I'll never be able to remember all this." "So what do you want to remember all this for?" Walter says. "You see, my mind." "Ah," Walter says, "there's nothing wrong with your mind." So I let the matter drop, and now I'm just here, not trying to remember, while the light slants bluish through the tarp, and the entire history of the East, it seems, unrolls before us. At last, after an hour or more, Walter asks abruptly, "Are you cold?" To which Stephen, who after living in Walter's community for 14 years, has probably experienced enough New England winters to last several lifetimes, responds, "Yes." And we move up to the barn where there's a pellet stove to continue our conversation. Stephen found Walter by chance while he was on his way to Canada in 1972 with his wife-to-be in search of a spiritual community. At a crossroads along the way, they ran into some acquaintances who directed them here, and the Canada trip was abandoned. At that point, Walter had been teaching for only 5 years or so, having returned from Japan in the 1960s, bearing 1/3 of Goto Zuigan's, his teacher's, ashes. His teacher had instructed Walter to return to America after his death, but told him to wait 5 years before teaching Zen. Partly perhaps to make sure Walter did return, his brother had bought him 500 acres of farm and woodland on the coast of Maine to do with as he pleased. It turned out to be the perfect setting for one of the first Zen communities begun by an American teacher. Walter first returned to teaching music, his primary means of support during his time in Japan. After the 5 years were up, he faced the task of trying to invent an authentic form of practice that would work on American soil, without having any prior models from which to depart. Although he's a sanctioned holder of his teacher's Rinzai Zen lineage, Walter always eschewed the use of titles or ranks. He told me during his conversation that his own teacher rarely even used the word Zen. Walter did maintain many of the aspects of traditional practice, however, including the custom of rejecting aspiring seekers in order to test their determination. When Stephen and his fiancée showed up to inquire about entering training, they were greeted with the words, "Go away, he doesn't want to see you," from a visiting Japanese monk. They left and returned and left again, not knowing how long this process might go on. Rumor has it that one student drove the nearly 10 hours from New York City 8 times and was refused on every occasion, only to be accepted as a student on his 9th attempt. The last time the couple returned, they glimpsed Nowak himself driving a tractor some distance from the house, and they set off across the intervening fields to approach him directly. "No, no," Walter began to shout, standing up in the tractor seat and waving his arms at them. "Go away, I don't need any more Zen students." But when at last they reached him, Walter climbed down from his seat saying, "So what do you all want from me anyway?" When they explained they wanted to become students of Zen, he said something like, "Well, I suppose I'm going to have to take you on then, aren't I?" And he embraced them both. It was Walter's custom during that period to deed an acre of land to each family that joined the community so they could build a house. Single people stayed in small cabins on the grounds. Many of the residents not only lived and practiced there, but worked alongside Walter every day, 6 days a week, except when a retreat was on. Ignoring the fact that many a sawyer ends up missing a finger or two, Walter set up a working sawmill on the property and operated the saw himself day after day, never seeming to worry that the activity might not be entirely compatible with his other calling as a pianist, or perhaps trusting in the close awareness he developed through his Zen training to protect him. Several years after moving on to the place, Stephen asked Walter if he could begin working at the mill, only to receive the same treatment he'd received when he'd asked to become a student. No, answered Walter each time he asked. Finally, Stephen mustered the boldness, which was no doubt the point of the exercise, to just show up one spring day when the mill was starting up for the season. What are you doing here? Walter asked him. I came to work, said Stephen. Said Walter, looking around at the other students. Well, I guess as long as he's here, we can let him sweep up, can't we? With that, he handed Stephen a broom, and Stephen had found his occupation for the next 8 years. Other such methods as this have given Nowak a reputation for sometimes being harsh, and apparently he could be if he felt it necessary for students' practice. Stephen remembers his years of working with Walter as largely having been filled with warmth and laughter. He had a way of shaking you out of yourself, said Stephen. If you showed up in a bad mood or were down in the dumps, he'd tease and prod at you, point out the beauty of the sky or the day, till you had to laugh at yourself and just got on with what needed to be done. Or he'd purposely get the truck or the tractor stuck in the mud, so you had a project that needed focusing on, anything to bring you out of yourself. Stephen had already shown me the zendo set at the bottom of a slope in a traditionally Japanese setting beside a pond with cattails. The interior reflected perfect craftsmanship, raised tans with rice stalk tatami mats and lots of exposed woods. You could feel the years of extensive practice that had taken place here. But now we're up at the barn, which currently serves as the performance space for the international opera troupe Walter put together after his retirement for teaching Zen. It's also the site for his own piano recitals. The acoustics of the place are said to be so ideal that it was used as a model for the famous Wolf Trap Performance Barn in Virginia. Walter, trickster figure that he is spinning off on long tangents about culture and government and human nature. It's all skullduggery, he's saying, nothing but skullduggery. He's fond of saying this about corporations, big business, governments, and any other power structure. And just when I think he'll never come back to Zen, he turns with a smile and says, but this isn't helping you with what you want to know for your book, is it? How was it, I asked, taking an opening, to come as an American into the monastic atmosphere at Daitokuji, having to pay strict obedience to your teacher, no matter how difficult it became? Did you ever question what you were doing? Walter shrugs and smiles. If you want to play the piano in a certain style, he says, you find the person who teaches that style, and you do what they say. If you want to do something else, you do something else. But if you want to learn what they have to learn, you follow their directions. He's silent for a moment. Besides, I had before me, every day, the great shining man, Goto Zuigan. I never doubted he knew what he was doing. We talk a little about his retirement from teaching and his work with the opera company, which he established as a project to open cultural exchange between the United States and the Soviet Union at a time when Cold War tensions were dangerously high. The group toured the Soviet Union, as well as other Eastern Bloc countries in Japan. Despite being made up largely of amateurs, many of whom were Zen students with no prior training in music, the group received standing ovations from Russian audiences who were accustomed to the best in Europe. I just couldn't feel comfortable any longer, says Walter, with sitting here pursuing our own practice, while out there tensions were building that could destroy the whole planet. In former times, Zen could afford to be apolitical, even during times of conflict, because whatever the damage, it was going to be limited. But when you have war machines out there that can destroy everything, well, at a certain point, I just had to do something. What I knew how to do was music. After 3 hours of nonstop high-energy interaction, I'm worn out, although Walter seems as fresh and bright as when we began. Finally, we're interrupted by a phone call. Walter says, well, I've done plenty of talking at this point, don't you think? And I take this as a signal that he wants to draw the afternoon's dialogue to a close. We do, after all, have plans for meeting him for dinner later that evening. As we walk back to the car, however, Walter says this was just Walter's way of feeling me out to see if I was finished. He could have gone on that way for hours, Stephen says. I haven't seen him do this. I haven't seen him this willing to talk in a long time. He was enjoying himself. He just wanted to let us off the hook. Later, over dinner and drinks at the local Thai restaurant, Walter gets political again. Everyone's got a point of view. How many points of view can you have? You can have 10,000 if you want. This one says, I disagree with that one. That one says, I disagree with the next. Another says, I disagree with both of you. What does it all add up to? Skullduggery. Do you think Buddhism will really take root here in America, I ask? Most of these people, they're not really interested in Buddhism. They're interested in what they can get, or they're interested in talking about Buddhism. Now, Godo Zwigon, my teacher, there was a man. Don't think that's me. Oh, no. Walter sips at his martini. Do you know how long it will take to solve the problems of the human race? He asked suddenly, leaning close, his blue eyes boring into mine. It'll take many kalpas. Do you know how long a kalpa is? I shake my head. Imagine an angel flies down out of heaven every 100 years, and the sleeve of her kimono brushes the top of Mount Fuji, as long as it takes to wear away that mountain. Or Manhattan, the whole city, imagine, it's filled with sesame seeds. Once every 100 years, an ant comes and takes one and carries it away. How long until all the seeds are gone? That's a kalpa. So, how are we doing on time?
You still got about 15 minutes, Sean.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to share a couple of short, cute practice stories about kids. And then we'll have some chance to talk and ask any questions. When I was doing these interviews, several people told me some stories about the wisdom of children and and compassion sometimes of children. So just want to share a couple here. A longtime Zen practitioner was about to set off on a car trip with his 5-year-old son to a lake in upstate New York. How long will it take us to get there, Daddy? Asked the boy. Oh, it's about 3 hours from here, said his father. Well, where is it 1 hour from? His father thought it over. Albany, I guess. Well, suggested the boy, why don't we just go from there? There's another one that is not in the same section. I'm just going to have to do it from memory because it's some other place in the book I haven't marked. This is told me, a couple of stories were told to me by Thich Nhat Hanh practitioners. One of them told the story about their 5-year-old son. She'd just come home from the hospital having given birth to a new baby. And the 5-year-old asked to be left alone privately in the room with the 5-year-old baby. So the parents agreed to this, but they were a little nervous. So they listened outside the door, and what they heard the boy saying to the baby was, hurry up and tell me about God and about life and where we came from. I'm starting to forget. And let's see. I think there's one more here I want to share. A practitioner in the lineage of Thich Nhat Hanh tells of discovering a dead baby squirrel in her yard with her young son. Feeling sad, she says, we watched our breathing for a moment. I was on my way out, but my son told me he would bury the squirrel. When I returned home, I saw a stick with a piece of paper attached to it propped next to one of our rose bushes. I bent down to look at it, and the paper read in my son's careful printing, "Here lays a small dead squirrel, ready to become a rose." So I guess we have a little time to chat or take questions, comments, objections.
Yeah, please. I think we're a small enough group. If you want to wave your hand or put up your electronic hand or just
Excuse me.
blur it out.
Or if we don't have questions or comments, I could share a few more stories. You like that? Okay.
Yeah, why don't you go ahead, John?
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to share a little bit about my meeting with Bernie. That's what I wanted to do. So it's my meeting with Bernie Glassman, founder of the Zen Peacemaker Order. Yeah, Zen Peacemakers. Bernie Glassman was wearing suspenders, red ones that my wife, Tanya, swears were ornamented with white daisies, although I don't remember this. We'd driven the 6 hours from San Francisco to Santa Barbara that morning for a 1 o'clock meeting, which I should have confirmed the day before, but didn't. Bernie, the senior teacher of the White Plum lineage, lived at the time of this writing in the area locals call the Mesa, at the top of a cliff that drops 100 or more feet to the blue Pacific below. His home was in an updated former hippie beach shack compound that rumor has it used to belong to the Beach Boys. Although the compound has since turned into a pricey bit of real estate, it still has that funky surf haven feel, with lawns that sprawl to the edges of the cliffs, and a sturdy white painted stairway winding all the way down to the beach below. In other words, it's about as close to the Pure Land as you're likely to get on this planet, especially on this late summer day with its unbroken expanse of blue sky spilling down to an equally unbroken expanse of water. Bernie, who I knew from my graduate student years at Naropa, had emailed me the gate code in advance. So when Tanya and I roll up in our rented Geo Metro at 1 o'clock on the dot and punch in the numbers, the gate rolls open as though by magic. But there's no answer to my knock at the bungalow that is supposed to be his. We circumnavigate the yard and peer in the back door, which is standing open. Japanese calligraphy adoring the walls tells us this must be the place. "Bernie," I called through the open door. "Roshi," for between his stature in the Zen community and his own disarming informality, I've never known what to call him. So I figured the best approach is to hedge my bets. There's no answer. We sit down to wait, enjoying the sight of pelicans flapping by. But Zen masters are not known generally for being late to appointments, and by the time 15 minutes has passed, I'm guessed they're sure there must have been a foul-up. Whatever reservoir of Zen calm I have left after several weeks of shuttling through the Bay Area's endless traffic jams in search of Zen teachers is in danger of draining away, since we've left this most important interview for last. And tomorrow we must drive back to San Francisco to catch our plane. Leaving Tanya sitting on Bernie's deck in case he shows up, I jump in the metro and jet off in search of the nearest payphone. This, of course, is before cell phones. The number I have for his Peacemaker order yields only an answering machine, although it does give several other numbers to try, which I attempt one after the other until all my change is gone, succeeding only in connecting to an ever-expanding Indra's net of phone numbers, each linked to and perfectly reflecting all the rest. It is now 1:30. I jerk open the door of the metro and rummage under the seat for lost coins, coming up with a quarter and 2 nickels. Never underestimate the value of disorder. along with an almost exhausted prepaid phone card. Heading back to the booth, I use the card to phone information, which gives me an entirely new number for the Peacemaker order, a scant instant before the card runs out and cuts me off. Down to my last 35 cents, I dial the new number. Remarkably, it's answered by a live human being, who shortly puts me on to Bernie, a miracle that convinces me I must have done something right in a prior lifetime. Sure, he remembers we had an appointment scheduled. Only problem is all his dates got scrambled in conversion to a new computer system, and he wasn't sure when it was. Can we meet him at the Peacemaker's new office in the Villa Maria Conference Center in Montecito? I jump into the metro, swoop back to pick up Tanya, and we leave endless summer behind for the sandstone-walled estates of Montecito, home to such Hollywood escapees as John Travolta and all manner of other millionaires, and now Prince Harry and his wife live in Montecito. I can't help but find it ironic as we wind past one mansion after another that Bernie Roshi, known for his pioneering work with the homeless, AIDS victims, and leading street retreats in New York, has landed in this lifestyles of the rich and famous setting at the foot of the Santa Ynez Mountains. But then again, hasn't Bernie always taught that we should cultivate the mind that excludes nothing? And given that he is perennially in need of funding for his next visionary project, it's entirely possible this might be the perfect setting to attract it. I won't go into all the things Bernie has done in terms of activism, because you probably all know this. And you probably know about his retreats at Auschwitz and Birkenau, and Bernie always really admired the eccentrics and in Zen, and although he was a very straight up student during his years training at Zen Center of Los Angeles, he quickly became quite an eccentric afterwards. So when I finally get to Bernie, I'll share that part. What is he going to do next is a common refrain in the Zen world when the subject of Bernie Glassman comes up. When we finally do reach his offices in Montecito after an extensive search, I'm surprised to find him not head-shaven as usual, but full-bearded with a small gray ponytail at the nape of his neck and sporting those infamous red suspenders. In this most recent phase of his evolution, he has decided to disrobe. Not to leave the practice, he explains, only to leave the priesthood. Just the latest unconventional move in a long history of unconventionality, certain to raise many eyebrows on his upcoming visit to Japan a few months hence. During our talk, I asked Bernie to look back over his 30+ years as a Zen teacher and activist, and particularly at the changes his activities have gone through recently. It's all been important and it's all been right, he says. I would never leave something that I was doing until I felt there were enough people doing it to carry on. But once I feel there's enough, I need to move on. So what's next? I asked him. When I got involved in Zen, Glassman says, leaning forward with a sudden vitality, and probably this is true for many people, a lot of my heroes were the unconventional ones. Then once you get into training, everyone becomes conventional. Well, I hope I always remain unconventional. I've trained in the conventional side of it, but me, I feel free. At this, he leans back and rummages through his pockets. And what he does next is something I would never have predicted in a million kalpas. For instance, I can put on my nose. Glassman suits actions to words by pulling from his pocket a rubber proboscis of the type preferred by clowns and sticking it on over his own nose. You probably are all familiar with this now, but at the time I had no idea he was going into this phase of studying clowning. So it was quite a surprise to have Bernie, the Zen teacher, pull out a red nose and stick it over his own nose. Trungpa Rinpoche once told me they had an extra position in Tibetan monasteries, that of the jester. Well, I've always wanted to be a jester, and that's what I want to bring to this stuff now, because it's gotten too sanctimonious, and there's too much conventionality. He grins at me from behind his nose, reveling in my reaction. I've created an order of clowns. It's called the Order of Disorder. We have a Wizard of Odd. We just had our first major installation of clowns. One of the rules is we have to have one nose with us all the time. At Change Your Mind Day, which is a Tricycle Magazine sponsored event, Buddhist event, whenever anybody asked me a question, I put my nose on before I would answer. I once did a workshop with Ram Dass. I was there with my nose and he's there with his wheelchair, so there's the two of us. Bernie laughs. I'd like to see at every center and every major event a clown who's free to say what they want. That's the feeling I'm after, he says, as the shadows across the mountains grow long and our conversation draws to a close. Like the jester at the courts. For the Japanese to do that, that would be a stretch. But for us, imagine Bush and Gore with noses on. He grins widely at the thought. Even if you don't have a nose, if you can imagine a nose on them, you're not going to be so uptight. I'm glad I shared that bit, because now I can picture our current politicians with clown noses on them. Maybe it lightens things up a little bit. It's after all somewhat the reality after all, isn't it? Anyway, might as well show it. Well, we just have a couple of minutes left, but a real pleasure sharing this material with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody, for sticking with us. And Sean, you mentioned early on when you started talking about Walter, I think, the question about whether or not Zen would take hold, here in the United States. And I'm sure you must have the numbers from other places, but as we know, in our lineage, White Plum lineage, one teacher who came in the 50s, and now there are 230 transmitted Zen teachers in that White Plum lineage line. And I don't know what it is for San Francisco or for other places, but the answer clearly is yes, isn't it?
I think we're the biggest, but San Francisco must be close behind. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really changed even over my lifetime. When, as I said before, when I first got interested in the 70s, what were there, 5, 6 books? I'm sure you remember. Those of you who were around then remember. Yeah, and now look at Sean's library behind him. Yeah. So. Yeah.
Okay, everyone, and once again, thank you so much. Keep your eye on our schedule. We have some interesting things coming up, and